cook on a very hot summer day. This recipe comes to you, and a lot of people will take this recipe and usually want it when it's a little bit brisk outside. In other words, snow's flying in Ohio, or a cold fall day after raking leaves. However, we kind of changed some of the things in the schedule. This was one of the things that we had not gotten to yet. As simple as it is, we decided that it might still be a good thing because, I mean, even on a hot summer day, everyone likes a little bit of soup, a little bit of sandwich. I had tomato soup and peanut butter and jelly the other day, and it was a great lunch. So, you know, whatever you want to have on that day, this tomato soup is obviously much better than the tomato soup I had on Monday, but Campbell's soup does make a good tomato soup. This, I think, is a lot better. It's homemade, and you can almost make it as quickly as you make it just taken out of a can. You're just opening up some crushed tomatoes and putting it together. This recipe also has an addition to it, basil. That's what's ideal about having this recipe now versus in the winter or in the fall, is there is nothing in our house that defines summer more than the air conditioner being turned on, is the fact that the basil is starting to kick in the garden. And this year, the garden's on my back porch, but we have 4 different kinds of basil that we are utilizing already. We've already hit it pretty hard. And I went out this morning and clipped off some this morning because this is known as basil tomato soup. There is something about basil that elevates just about anything in an Italian recipe. Other than salt, maybe oregano, basil to me speaks Italian. And we have it on cheese. We had a pizza the other night that I made. We put basil on it. So it's a go-to fresh herb in my house. Probably 9 months out of the year, we utilize basil. This recipe is an elevation of tomato soup for the basil that's added, and it also has a little bit of cream, which adds to the richness and the body of the soup that we're making today. So I will also touch upon grilled cheese, but the grilled cheese will not be so much as a demonstration, as I'll show you a couple things. I'll have some discussions about it. But as I was talking with Lori and Brenda, there's like 60 recipes to make grilled cheese. You might have a preferred bread. You might have a preferred butter to use on the bread. You might use mayo, and I'll talk about that later. You might use processed cheese. You might use cheese that is Swiss or Jarlsberg or Irish. There are a lot of great cheeses. The one thing that you want to make sure in your grilled cheese, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, is that it melts. A grilled cheese is not grilled cheese unless you have gooey, spreading, melting cheese in your sandwich. So let's get to the tomato soup, and then we'll move on to the grilled cheese discussion. I've already made a few this morning. Yes, we were making grilled cheese at our house at 8:30 this morning, but there was a reason why, so I could present it to you. I can't move the cameras around as much in my kitchen due to the arm that I have. So what I'm going to do is talk about making the tomato soup. If you have the recipe in front of you, you'll see it's really 6 very simple ingredients. Most of these ingredients, I would think, for the most part, you would have in your pantry. It's another good thing about this recipe when it's more difficult to go to Kroger or Meijer or Jungle Jim's or Sam's or Costco, is that you have the opportunity to pretty much make a fresh homemade soup just by going in your pantry and finding a couple of items here. So, Brenda, I'm going to turn my face off, create less nausea in the room, and then turn it over to the pan so I can talk about making the soup. So bear with me, if you will. And hopefully I don't send, can you see the pan?
Yes.
All right, so the pan is in the visual. All right, so let's talk about the soup. Tomato soup is, you know, obviously the main component is tomatoes. As you'll see here, this is crushed tomatoes. It calls for it in the recipe. You can use fresh tomatoes if you have some starting to come in your garden. The one thing I'll say about fresh tomatoes, you want to make sure you're selective in what tomatoes you use. You want to use heavy, fresh, flesh kind of tomatoes. And what I'm saying there is usually Roma. Roma doesn't have a lot of juice. It's very concentrated as far as flesh, because you don't want your soup to be just wet and no body to it. And that's what fresh tomatoes will do. But Roma is a great tomato to use for sauces and soups. Some of you might even have that in your garden. But we're going to go with canned tomatoes. It'll still taste great and fresh today, I can assure you. This is one of the varieties I use. I've also used Hunt's. There's also a couple of others. San Ramon tomatoes are one of my favorites, but this is just what Kroger substituted. I had chosen another tomato on my click list, and Kroger gave me this one. But we're going to open 2 cans of these crushed tomatoes as the first thing to incorporate in the soup. So it says stir the tomatoes together with the chicken. So that's what we're going to do. I've already pre-opened my tomatoes. So this is the first can of 28 ounces. You can see it's kind of a nice sauce. If you like, you can use diced tomatoes in too if you want more body in your soup. It's pretty simple. Or you can use one crushed. Those tomatoes are good. I just tasted it on my finger. You can also use a couple other things if you like. But this is the basis of the soup. As you can see, it's got a lot of body. There's not a lot of water in it. We'll add some things to that to do just that. One of the things I wanted to mention that a lot of people don't understand is they'll see recipes for tomato soup and putting a little bit of baking soda in the soup. If anyone in the audience or anybody you're entertaining, could be a family member or it could be a child that's real sensitive to the acid that a tomato brings to the table, put just half a teaspoon, not table, but teaspoon of baking soda in the recipe. You will neutralize the acid that's already in the tomatoes. So that's the tip of the day is if you are acid sensitive to the tomatoes, and that's why you don't use it, it's a great little addition to just take a pinch or a half a teaspoon or a quarter of baking soda and just drop that in. You'll find that it'll neutralize the acid that you experience in a tomato. So we put the 2 cans or 28 ounces times 2. So we've got 56 ounces of tomato basics right now. Now we want to add the chicken broth. So this is the liquid that comes into the soup. Now this is chicken stock, chicken broth. This is Kroger. This is 32 ounces, so I'm going to use half of this container. Once I'm done with this container, I will put the rest of it in my fridge and store it for another rainy day. So now you're adding the chicken broth. You can use vegetable broth if you're a vegetarian. Now this recipe is very close to being almost totally non-animal fat except for the fats in it, and easily substitute vegetable broth and not put the creams in if you prefer. So once you got that in, you want to start, go ahead and stir it. This is one of my favorite stirs. And just incorporate the tomato with the chicken broth. And I'm going to pretend that this isn't cold right now, and I'm going to move it over to my stove. But right now, what you want to do is you want to bring the soup to a boil. Why is that important? Almost every recipes will say bring to a boil and then bring it down. It's very important. It's one of those safety things you want to do. Bring it up to a boil quickly, then back it off to medium to finish cooking it. And you want to simmer it to reduce this tomato and chicken broth for about 10 minutes. That's all it takes, and you're almost done with the soup by the time you get to that point. So now you want to add in, this has been on for 10 minutes, you want to add your basil. Now, when I'm doing basil, I am using my fresh leaves, and it calls for 18 total fresh leaves. Now, at my house, 18 is a little light on the basil. So if you want to add a little bit more, please feel free. But I put some ice cubes in this after I cut it, a little bit of water to keep them fresh, and they are like I just picked them this morning, just a couple minutes ago. They're not wilted. They will wilt when they are in the fire of the oven, but this is great. So there we go. So there's your basil. So after you're done with this, you want to add a little bit of sugar. Just a simple teaspoon and you got it. So there's that. Go ahead and put it back on the heat again. And what you're going to do here is you're going to wilt the tomato and you're going to wilt the basil right in there into your incorporation of your dish. Now you want to stir in some cream. Hold on, I got to get a mixing thing. There you go. So there's your cream. And it also calls for a thing of butter. It calls a half cup of butter. What is a half a cup of butter is also known as a stick of butter. Now this is right out of the fridge, but if that was cold, you'd see that I had basically easily incorporated that. Now, it changes a little bit of color, but that color is perfect in this tomato soup. So, what I do here, when it's not cold, is I put the tomato soup in, and then I take one of my basils, and I star it, and I put it in the center, and that's how the tomato soup is served. You might want to put a little salt or pepper in it, and then you're all set. But that is the tomato soup, and according to the tomato recipe. All right, so let's move on from the tomato soup over to the grilled cheese. Voila, already done, like in the kitchen. Now, there are two thoughts on grilled cheese. One is, do you use butter on the bread, white bread, to grill, or do you use mayo? And then when you use mayo, do you use Duke's or do you use Hellmann's? On this experiment, I used Hellmann's and I also used butter. This slice was done with butter. This slice was done with mayonnaise. So it's really up to you what you like or your own preference. So whatever you prefer, that's what I would go with. What you'll find is the mayonnaise cooks and browns quicker, but I think the crispness of the butter on this is a little bit more to my preference. So we have a tendency to use more butter than we do mayonnaise, but mayonnaise is eggs and oil. Butter is butter. So that's how that's made. Basically, all you're doing with your grilled cheese is you're warming up the griddle. After you warm up the griddle, you will get 4 slices of bread out to make 2 sandwiches. Butter or mayonnaise, the side that's going to hit the griddle first. Put that on a griddle, drop 2 to 4 slices. I used 4. I like my grilled cheese to be substantial. So if I'm using Jarlsberg or processed cheese, I mean, this is the process we all have in our fridge, or you can fancy it up. My wife, the executive producer of today's show, loves to take hers with a melted white or cheddar cheese, and then she likes to slice a Granny Smith apple. After she slices the Granny Smith apple real thin, she incorporates that as another texture and another part of the body of the grilled cheese. I think it's a great addition. It's a way to fancy up your grilled cheese other than simply bread, butter, mayo, and a couple slices of cheese. So on here, once you got the griddle going, you got your first piece of bread on, you're gonna throw your cheese on, whatever your choice cheese is. Just make sure the butter and the cheese you choose will melt. That's very, very important because it won't be gooey. The last thing about your grilled cheese is then you put the second part on after the cheese has started to melt, and then you have your sandwich. Now, here's the last thing of today. Here's a standard cut. Here's a fancy cut. If you ever want to upgrade your sandwich, this triangle always makes for a pretty sandwich. So, you know, you got grilled cheese like that, or the old-fashioned way like this. I always like to triangle it. So you're basically taking a full piece of bread, cutting it this way. It's fancy, it adds, it looks nice. And then if you like, you can put a little condiment there to make it look pretty. All right? Questions?